Hegel's philosophy starts from one obsession: understanding reality as a living process instead of a collection of things. He looked at the world and said, everything, thought, history, nature, society, is not static. It moves, evolves, unfolds. The key to this is dialectics. People throw that word around, but Hegel actually gave it a precise meaning. It's not just thesis, antithesis, synthesis, like the pop summaries say. It's about how contradictions drive reality forward. Every idea, every state of being carries within it a tension, something incomplete or inconsistent. That tension pushes it to transform into something new. For Hegel, this isn't just about logic, it's about everything. The universe itself is this unfolding argument, constantly resolving and reforming itself through contradictions. Reality, to Hegel, is not a dead collection of facts. It's alive, a self-developing whole that thinks through us, through history, through nature. That's what he means by absolute idealism. The absolute is not some God floating above everything. It's the totality of existence becoming self-aware through time. The idealism means that reality is not something we stand outside of. Our thoughts, our consciousness, our logic are part of the same movement that builds the world. So when humans think, argue, build societies, and evolve, it's the universe thinking about itself. Hegel believes that consciousness isn't separate from reality. It is reality, in its most reflective form. This sounds abstract, but Hegel grounds it in everyday life. Think about how you grow as a person. You hold beliefs, then encounter experiences that contradict them. Those contradictions force you to adapt, refine, or completely transform your perspective. Each time you grow, you're not just adding knowledge, you're changing the structure of your understanding. That's dialectics in action. For Hegel, the entire world works that way. Nature evolves, societies evolve, human thought evolves. And every step forward includes the contradictions that came before it, not by erasing them, but by absorbing and transforming them into something higher. This movement of contradictions shaping new realities is what Hegel calls the dialectical process. It's not mechanical, it's organic. He uses the term Aufhebung, which means to both cancel and preserve. Every new stage of understanding cancels the limits of the last stage, but preserves its core truth. So instead of seeing history or thought as a chain of random events, Hegel sees it as a single continuous organism growing towards self-awareness. The world, in his eyes, is an unfinished sentence being written by existence itself. When he talks about spirit, Geist, he doesn't mean some mystical ghost. He means human consciousness as a collective process. Spirit is the evolution of awareness from the most basic self-recognition to the full understanding of freedom and reason. Individual minds are moments of spirit realizing itself. That's why Hegel's philosophy is historical. He believes that truth unfolds through time, not as eternal facts dropped from the sky, but as living experiences. Freedom is the central purpose of that unfolding. For Hegel, freedom doesn't mean doing whatever you want. It means living in alignment with the rational order of reality, understanding yourself as part of a larger self-conscious whole. True freedom isn't isolation, it's participation in a reality that understands itself. When you act with awareness of the whole, not just your impulses or biases, you're embodying the rational freedom that spirit is evolving toward. That's why Hegel links philosophy, history, and politics together. Every era, every culture, every conflict represents a moment of spirit working through contradiction toward greater freedom. Ancient empires valued order but crushed individuality. The Enlightenment championed individuality but fragmented meaning. Each stage solves one contradiction while creating another. For Hegel, that's progress, not linear or smooth, but dialectical, full of crises and turning points that drive self-awareness forward. So when Hegel says the real is rational and the rational is real, he's not being elitist or idealistic in the naive sense. He's saying that reality, deep down, operates through reason, not cold calculation, but the kind of logic that connects everything as part of one process. Even chaos and suffering are part of that logic because they reveal contradictions that force development. The rational isn't about being comfortable, it's about being necessary. What exists, exists because it fits into this self-unfolding whole. And once it no longer fits, once it contradicts itself too deeply, it transforms or collapses. That's why revolutions happen, why paradigms shift, why human consciousness keeps evolving. So, to put it simply, Hegel's philosophy is the idea that reality is a self-developing process of thought. Everything, nature, mind, history, art, politics, is an expression of that process. We are not observers of that process, we are part of it. Thinking, for Hegel, is not just describing the world, it is the world, becoming aware of itself. That's why his philosophy is so demanding. It's not just about knowledge, it's about transformation. Understanding Hegel means seeing your own thinking as a stage in the universe's evolution toward self-conscious freedom. Consciousness, for Hegel, isn't a static thing sitting in your head. It's a dynamic process that's constantly moving between opposites, knowing itself and knowing the world. He begins by showing that self-awareness doesn't exist in isolation. To know yourself, you need contrast. You need something that isn't you, an object, another person, an external world to reflect yourself against. That's why for Hegel, knowledge always begins with a tension between subject and object. You're the knower, the world is what's known, and between those two poles lies a constant back and forth struggle for understanding. That's where the famous master and slave idea comes in, not as a historical episode, but as a metaphor for how consciousness develops. When two self-aware beings encounter each other, they both want recognition. They both want their sense of self to be affirmed. But recognition can't be one-sided. If one dominates the other, becoming the master, they get control but not true recognition, because their validation comes from someone they don't respect as equal. The slave, on the other hand, while oppressed, actually gains something deeper. Through labor, struggle, and contact with reality, he learns how to shape the world and himself. Over time, the servant's consciousness matures, while the master becomes dependent on illusions of superiority. This is how Hegel sees human progress, as a series of transformations through conflict and reversal. The struggle for recognition drives history, because every social, political, and moral system eventually reveals its contradictions. When you push reality too far in one direction, it rebounds, creating a higher synthesis. Freedom for Hegel grows from this tension, not by eliminating conflict, but by passing through it consciously. Reason plays a massive role in this process. For Hegel, reason isn't some abstract faculty sitting in your mind. It's the structure of reality itself. To think rationally is to think in harmony with how reality actually works, to see the interconnections instead of fragmented parts. Every form of knowledge, every science, every art is reason unfolding in a different shape. Logic for him is not about static rules, it's the dynamic grammar of reality's movement. It's how the absolute, reality as a whole, articulates itself. So when Hegel writes about phenomenology of spirit, he's not describing mystical experiences, he's mapping how consciousness evolves through its own self-corrections. You start by seeing the world as something external. Then you realize your perceptions are limited. Then you learn that what you see depends on how you think. Eventually, you reach a point where you see that reality and thought are two sides of the same movement. This is the journey from naive awareness to absolute knowing, when consciousness finally grasps that it is the process by which the world becomes self-aware. That's what makes Hegel's system so powerful. It's not about dogma, it's about development. Every error, every contradiction is part of progress.
Even falsehood has a role because it forces correction. The dialectic doesn't eliminate mistakes, it uses them. That's why Hegel's philosophy feels alive. It's not trying to freeze truth, it's watching truth evolve. And this has huge implications for history. Hegel sees human history as spirit working itself out through time. Empires, revolutions, religions, philosophies, they're all stages of spirit realizing its freedom. History isn't chaos, it's the record of the universe thinking through humanity. Ancient societies discovered order. The Greeks discovered individuality. Christianity introduced the infinite value of the person. Modernity brought self-determination and reason. Each step negates and preserves the last, carrying forward the essence while transcending its limits. Freedom, again, is the end goal of this process, but Hegel's freedom isn't the freedom of desire, it's the freedom of understanding necessity. You're free when you grasp the logic behind your world, when you're no longer a slave to ignorance or impulse. True freedom comes from knowing how things fit together and aligning yourself with that rational totality. In that sense, freedom and knowledge are the same thing. So consciousness grows through contradictions, reason structures that growth, and history records it. The whole of existence, in Hegel's view, is spirit working itself out toward complete self-awareness. That's why his system feels like a cosmic autobiography, the universe writing its own story through human minds, societies, and ideas. When Hegel talks about logic, he doesn't mean what we usually mean, not formal logic or argument rules, but the logic of being itself. He believed that reality has an inner structure, a rhythm of development, and that this structure can be understood rationally. Logic, for him, is the blueprint of existence. It's how being organizes itself, step by step, through pure thought. Before anything material exists, before nature or mind, there is the movement of thought itself, shaping what's possible. That's why his science of logic starts from the simplest possible concept, pure being.
He says, imagine pure being, stripped of everything. No properties, no time, no qualities, just pure existence. But if you think about it, pure being is indistinguishable from pure nothing. If there's nothing to differentiate it, then being and nothing collapse into one another. That tension between being and nothing gives rise to becoming. That's the first movement of the dialectic, a self-generated process, not created by an external cause, but by the inherent instability of abstract ideas themselves. From there, thought continues to develop, creating more complex categories: quality, quantity, measure, essence, concept, and so on. Each category both resolves and contains contradictions from the previous one. This is how Hegel's system grows, not linearly, but dialectically, like a spiral. Every step both preserves and transcends what came before. So the logic is like a living organism. It starts from a seed, pure being, and unfolds into a complex structure, the concept or idea. This movement is not just intellectual, it's how reality itself operates. Everything, matter, life, consciousness, follows this same dynamic pattern of self-negation and self-realization. Now, when the idea reaches a certain completeness in thought, it must externalize itself. That's where nature comes in. For Hegel, nature is spirit alienating itself, the idea made external, fragmented, and unconscious. The laws of physics, chemistry, and biology are the idea expressing itself in material form. Nature is the idea in space and time, not yet aware of itself. Every natural process, from gravity to evolution, is the idea trying to return to consciousness, to become self-aware again. That's why Hegel's view of nature is dynamic. He doesn't see it as a dead machine, but as a living totality in motion, gradually organizing itself toward higher complexity. Then, through the emergence of life and eventually human beings, spirit returns to itself. Humans are the point where nature becomes conscious of its own structure. Spirit is the idea that knows itself as idea. That's why for Hegel, philosophy, art, and religion aren't just cultural products, they're stages of spirit self-recognition. The human mind is the universe reflecting on its own nature. This loop, from logic to nature to spirit, is the entire architecture of Hegel's system. The absolute isn't something outside this process, it's the process itself. The absolute is the totality of all development, the unity that holds opposites together without erasing them. God, in Hegel's terms, isn't a separate being sitting above creation. God is reality coming to know itself through the dialectical movement of existence. That's why he said the truth is the whole, not a part, not a static formula, but the living system of all interrelations. Understanding this helps to see how Hegel's thought feels both mystical and hyper-rational. He's trying to capture how everything connects, how logic turns into nature, nature turns into consciousness, and consciousness turns back toward logic again. It's a closed circuit of self-knowing being. But within that circuit, every contradiction, every failure, every negation is necessary. There's no evil, no chaos, no randomness that stands completely outside. Everything plays a role in spirit's unfolding. This also explains why Hegel's philosophy had such a massive influence. Marx took the dialectic and turned it material. Instead of spirit unfolding, it was social and economic relations transforming through conflict. Kierkegaard flipped it toward the individual, focusing on personal existence rather than universal spirit. Nietzsche took Hegel's critique of fixed truths and pushed it into radical self-creation. Even modern systems theory, cybernetics, and deep ecology echo this Hegelian idea that everything evolves through tension, interdependence, and feedback. But back to Hegel himself, his ultimate insight is that contradiction isn't the problem to be erased, it's the engine of development. Every idea contains its opposite because thought is always stretching beyond itself. The moment something becomes fixed, it dies intellectually. To think is to let the idea live, to let it go through the cycle of being challenged, overturned, and reborn on a higher level. That's the dialectic. So, in everyday terms, Hegel's philosophy teaches the truth is a journey, not a snapshot. You can't isolate a single statement or belief and call it absolute truth, because meaning only exists within a total context that's always shifting. The point is to understand the motion, not freeze the moment. To think dialectically is to see through contradictions instead of choosing sides, to understand how opposites define and complete each other. Hegel's view of ethics and politics builds directly out of the structure of consciousness and spirit. For him, morality isn't about following external rules or personal feelings, it's about how freedom expresses itself in a rational social order. The individual doesn't stand outside society, they're the product of it. And society, in turn, isn't just a collection of individuals, it's the embodiment of collective spirit, what he calls Geist. This means your freedom isn't simply the ability to do whatever you want, it's the ability to live according to laws and customs that you understand as your own, that you recognize as rational.
He calls this ethical life Sittlichkeit. It's not morality as abstract principle, Moralität, but morality as lived practice. Ethical life happens in the institutions that structure human existence: the family, civil society, and the state. Each of these is a level where spirit becomes more concrete, where freedom takes shape. The family is where love and unity first appear, the immediate form of spirit, where individuals see themselves as one organism. But the family is limited because it's bound by natural ties. It can't handle difference or conflict well. That's why spirit must move beyond it to civil society. In civil society, individuals pursue their own interests, exchange goods, and interact under the rule of law. This is the arena of competition, inequality, and individuality. It's where people learn to mediate their private goals with the needs of others. But civil society, left alone, tends toward fragmentation. It creates poverty, alienation, and class tension. So, spirit must move again toward the state, the rational organization that unites particular interests into a universal whole. The state, for Hegel, isn't just a government or a set of laws. It's the living embodiment of ethical reason. It's where freedom becomes objective, where the rational will becomes visible in institutions. That's why Hegel said the state is the march of God in the world, not because he worshipped authority, but because he saw in the state the culmination of spirit's development. The state is reason externalized. When laws, rights, and duties align with rational understanding, you get a world where people are truly free, not in opposition to others, but through shared recognition. This is why Hegel rejects both atomistic individualism and blind collectivism. For him, true freedom doesn't mean escaping the system. It means understanding and participating in it consciously. The anarchic desire to live outside society, it is, in his view, a kind of immaturity, because spirit's freedom grows only through form and structure. You can't have meaning without limits. Freedom isn't chaos, it's harmony with necessity. This political vision connects directly to his philosophy of history. Each stage of civilization expresses a deeper realization of freedom. The Orient had the idea that only one person was free. The Greeks saw some citizens as free. Modernity, for the first time, recognizes that all people are free. That's the dialectic of freedom unfolding through time, from despotism to democracy, from obedience to self-legislation. Every revolution, reform, or upheaval is spirit testing new forms of self-realization. History isn't random. It's the education of humanity. But Hegel's end of history isn't a literal end. It's a state of self-consciousness. When reason fully understands itself, when spirit knows that everything, even conflict, is part of its own process, history as struggle ends in comprehension. It doesn't mean change stops, but that we stop being blind participants and start being conscious creators of the system we live in. This connects to his idea of art, religion, and philosophy as the highest forms of spirit. Art gives spirit a sensory form. It makes the idea visible. Religion gives spirit an imaginative, symbolic form. It represents truth in stories and myths. Philosophy gives spirit its purest form, thought knowing itself as thought. In that sense, philosophy is the self-consciousness of the world. It's not a passive reflection, but an active moment in spirit's evolution. The absolute, then, is not something you discover like a hidden object. It's what emerges when you realize the unity of thought and being. When you grasp that every limit you encounter is part of an infinite movement, you've reached absolute knowing. It's not omniscience, it's awareness of the process itself. The absolute is the self-awareness of reality, not a static truth. This is why Hegel's system feels both complete and open-ended. It's total because it accounts for everything: logic, nature, mind, society, history, art, religion, philosophy, as one self-developing whole. But it's open because that development never stops. Spirit keeps finding new ways to know itself. Every thinker, every culture, every technology is another expression of the same unfolding logic. And that's also what makes Hegel both inspiring and infuriating. He doesn't give you answers. He gives you a way to see movement inside everything. There's no resting point, no final doctrine. To understand anything truly, you have to think historically, relationally, dialectically. Every truth carries its opposite. Every progress creates new problems. Every synthesis becomes a new thesis for future conflict. It's a philosophy of constant awakening, where even contradictions are signs of deeper coherence. Hegel's take on art is one of the most fascinating parts of his system because it shows how deeply he believed that beauty is not just decoration, it's a form of truth. For him, art isn't a luxury or an escape from reality. It's how spirit reveals itself sensuously. Art speaks in concepts, religion in symbols, but art speaks in form, in visible, audible, tangible reality. Every painting, statue, poem, or piece of music is spirit showing itself to itself through feeling and perception. It's thought, but embodied.
But just like everything else in Hegel's system,
art evolves dialectically. He says there are three main stages in this evolution: the symbolic, the classical, and the romantic. The symbolic stage is where spirit is still struggling to express itself clearly. Think of ancient Egyptian pyramids or Mesopotamian temples. Massive, mysterious, overwhelming. The form doesn't quite fit the meaning yet. The gods are abstract, the figures are stiff, and nature feels bigger than man. The idea is there, but it's buried under excess, spirit trying to speak, but not yet fluent. Then comes the classical stage, the balance point. This is ancient Greek art, where form and content reach perfect harmony. The human body becomes the vessel of the divine. Beauty here is clarity, spirit completely at home in physical form. There's no inner conflict, no alienation. A Greek statue doesn't symbolize something beyond itself. It is the embodiment of ideal form. Spirit and matter are in perfect synthesis. But that harmony can't last forever because spirit never stops moving. The romantic stage begins when consciousness deepens and inwardness awakens. Christianity plays a huge role here. Suddenly, divinity isn't just external perfection, but inner feeling, subjective experience. Art starts turning inward, toward emotion, faith, and individuality. Think of Gothic cathedrals, medieval painting, romantic poetry, or even modern abstract art. The outer form becomes less important than the inner meaning. The spiritual now transcends the material. The idea is too deep to fit into visible shape. This is why, for Hegel, art eventually reaches its limit. Spirit becomes too self-conscious for sensory expression. This doesn't mean art dies, it means its role changes. In modern times, art still matters, but it's no longer the highest form of truth. That place belongs to philosophy, where the idea understands itself directly, without needing images or symbols. Art gives way to thought, not as a loss, but as a transformation. The same spirit that once spoke through marble and music now speaks through logic and language. That transition continues in religion. For Hegel, religion is how humanity imagines the absolute before it understands it conceptually. It's the idea in the form of feeling and representation. Where philosophy uses concepts, religion uses pictures, stories of gods, saviors, and creation. These aren't lies or fantasies. They're spirit expressing truth in imaginative language. Every religion, in Hegel's view, is a stage in spirit's self-revelation. Primitive religions sense divinity in nature. Polytheism fragments the divine into many forms. Monotheism unifies them. Christianity, for Hegel, is the highest religious expression because it presents the divine as both universal and personal. God becoming human, spirit recognizing itself in finite form. But even Christianity as religion is still symbolic. It expresses truth in faith and feeling, not in pure thought. Philosophy, then, is the completion of religion, not by denying it, but by understanding its meaning. When philosophy grasps that the divine process it imagines as God is the same dialectical process that structures thought and reality, religion is fulfilled, not destroyed. The story of God becomes the story of spirit, the universe realizing itself through consciousness. This leads to the final movement, absolute knowing. Absolute knowing doesn't mean knowing everything like a database. It means understanding the total process, knowing that thought, being, and spirit are one self-developing reality. It's not a new piece of information, it's an awareness of the movement that generates all information. When spirit reaches that point, it realizes that it has never been separate from the world it was trying to understand. The knower and the known were always two sides of the same unfolding process. In that realization, the circle closes, But it's a living circle, always moving. Spirit doesn't stop existing or learning. It just becomes self-aware. This is why Hegel's system is often called absolute idealism. It's not about escaping reality into pure mind. It's about seeing that reality itself is mind-like, rational, and self-determining. The material world, history, culture, logic, all of it is spirit expressing and knowing itself. If you think about it in modern terms, it's almost like a grand theory of consciousness evolution. The universe starts as pure potential, becomes matter, becomes life, becomes mind, and finally becomes aware that it was spirit all along. That's the absolute in Hegel's sense, the unity that includes every difference within it. What's radical about this is that it changes what truth means. Truth isn't correspondence between a statement and a fact. It's the total process that makes facts and statements possible. It's dynamic, historical, self-correcting. Hegel gives you a way to think about everything, science, politics, love, art, God, as interrelated moments of a single, infinite self-unfolding. That's what makes his philosophy so hard, but also so revolutionary. Once you see reality as dialectical, nothing is isolated anymore. Everything is part of the whole. Everything is spirit in motion.
To connect Hegel's absolute idealism with modern thought, you have to start with the idea that reality thinks. That's the heart of his system. Not that there's a ghostly mind floating above the world, but that the world itself is rationally structured and self-organizing. Everything that exists follows an internal logic that can, in principle, be understood. This is why Hegel could say that philosophy is its time grasped in thought. Every thera, every discipline, every discovery is spirit understanding itself through new forms. Now, when you take that idea and look at modern science, it actually fits better than it first seems. Hegel's logic isn't opposed to science. It's a way of seeing how scientific laws arise from deeper principles of organization. Physics, for example, studies the laws of matter, but those laws aren't random. They reveal how reality differentiates and integrates itself. Evolutionary biology shows how life emerges through contradiction, competition, adaptation, synthesis, which is exactly how Hegel thinks spirit moves. Neuroscience reveals feedback loops between perception, memory, and cognition, the mind knowing itself through itself. Even artificial intelligence, in a sense, is an externalization of that same dialectical movement, thought constructing a model of thought. From Hegel's perspective, none of these are separate. They're all the idea expressing itself at different levels of complexity. The dialectic is the grammar of being, the pattern that runs through atoms, ecosystems, and societies alike. Every system develops by negating its limitations, moving toward a higher level of self-regulation. That's why his philosophy feels oddly modern, even though it's 2 centuries old, because it's not about old metaphysics, it's about self-organizing systems. Take psychology as another example. For Hegel, self-consciousness is always mediated. You only become aware of yourself through something that isn't you. Modern psychology confirms this. Identity forms through relationships, language, and reflection. The ego isn't a given. It's constructed through recognition. That's why the master-slave dynamic still applies today. Think about social media validation, status hierarchies, or even workplace dynamics. Recognition still drives human behavior, and dependence on it still creates alienation. The dialectic is alive in everyday life. We all oscillate between wanting autonomy and needing acknowledgement. Hegel's insights into recognition influenced entire traditions of thought: existentialism, psychoanalysis, social theory. Freud's idea of the unconscious can even be seen as spirit's own self-alienation, reason estranged from itself.
Lacan's mirror stage, where the child recognizes itself in a reflection, echoes Hegel's notion that selfhood is born through mediation. Marx took this further. Instead of spirit alienating itself through thought, he said humans alienate themselves through labor and material relations. But the structure is the same. Progress through contradiction, reconciliation through transformation. In the political sphere, Hegel's influence is just as deep. His view that freedom must be embodied in rational institutions shaped everything from modern constitutional theory to Marxism and even liberal democracy. He taught that freedom isn't about isolation, but about participation. That you become free not by rejecting the world, but by understanding and acting within it consciously. When institutions reflect reason, when laws are rational and individuals recognize themselves in them, spirit becomes actual. The state, for Hegel, isn't supposed to dominate the individual, but to be the structure where personal and universal freedom meet. Of course, this idea can be misused, and it has been. Later thinkers distorted Hegel's concept of the state into totalitarian ideals, but that's because they froze the dialectic. For Hegel, no political form is final. Every system, even one that embodies freedom, carries contradictions that demand transformation. That's why his thought is inherently revolutionary. It sanctifies change as the essence of reason. In art and culture, you see the same pattern. Every artistic movement arises as a negation of what came before. Classicism gives way to romanticism, realism to modernism, modernism to postmodernism, each one both rejecting and preserving the last. This is Hegel's dialectic playing out in aesthetics. Spirit constantly reshapes how it expresses itself, moving from harmony to fragmentation, to reflection and back again. Even today's digital culture, the endless flow of content, irony and self-reference, is spirit exploring itself through new technological forms. In a more abstract sense, Hegel's absolute idealism provides a framework for understanding meaning itself. Meaning doesn't exist in isolated facts or words, but in their relationships, in the whole network of interdependence. This foreshadows structuralism and systems theory. Everything only makes sense within a totality, and that totality is dynamic. So when linguistics or computer science talk about recursive structures, feedback loops, or emergent properties, they're unknowingly speaking Hegel's language.
What makes Hegel especially relevant now is that his system unites opposites that modern thought often separates: reason and emotion, science and spirit, individual and society, freedom and necessity. He shows that you can't understand one without the other because they define each other through contrast. There's no self without the other, no freedom without law, no reason without desire, no truth without error. To think dialectically is to hold these opposites together without collapsing into cynicism or dogma. It's a training in intellectual balance, a way to see how tension itself generates progress. If you translate that into modern life, it becomes a philosophy of growth. You can't develop by avoiding contradiction. You grow by confronting it, integrating it, and moving beyond it. Every personal crisis, every social conflict, every scientific paradox is a microcosm of spirit's larger movement. Hegel's system gives you a way to interpret struggle as meaning, not chaos. And that's why his thought keeps resurfacing in new contexts. Whether it's AI learning from its mistakes, economies evolving through crises, or individuals growing through trauma, the same pattern holds: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Not as a formula, but as a rhythm of life. Hegel didn't invent this movement, he just made it conscious. When people talk about Hegel's dialectic, they often reduce it to that simple formula: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But that was never actually his own wording. It's a shorthand that misses how dynamic his method really is. The dialectic isn't a mechanical three-step process. It's a living pattern of thought where ideas evolve through their own internal tensions. Every concept carries within it the seeds of its opposite, and through the clash between what it tries to be and what it cannot avoid being, a new, richer idea is born. The synthesis doesn't erase the conflict, it preserves it, transforms it, and lifts it to a higher level. Hegel's way of thinking about truth follows this same rhythm. Truth isn't a static correspondence between a statement and a fact. It's the whole movement of understanding. When you think something is true, that truth always sits within a larger process that will eventually show its limits. That doesn't mean it's false. It means it's partial. The dialectic turns even error into a moment of truth, because every failure of understanding reveals the next stage of awareness. Reality for Hegel isn't a finished thing that you can grasp once and for all. It's a self-correcting story. That's why he thought of philosophy as a kind of therapy for the intellect. We tend to cling to fixed positions. We take sides. We separate opposites. We treat categories as absolute. Hegel teaches you to loosen your grip, to see that every position becomes its opposite when pushed far enough. Freedom becomes tyranny when unbounded. Order becomes chaos when too rigid. Reason becomes irrational when detached from life. The point is to see movement where others see boundaries. Thinking dialectically trains you to recognize that contradictions aren't signs of failure, but of vitality. Modern philosophy, in many ways, has been reacting to this insight ever since. Existentialism took Hegel's focus on self-consciousness and turned it inward, emphasizing the anxiety and responsibility that come with freedom. Phenomenology picked up his idea that consciousness is always intentional, always directed towards something beyond itself. Structuralism and post-structuralism borrowed his notion that meaning arises from relations, not isolated entities. Even in analytic philosophy, where Hegel was long dismissed, you find echoes of his thought in logic, language theory, and the study of systems. One of the most powerful legacies of Hegel's dialectic is how it reframes progress. We usually think of progress as a straight line, things getting better over time. Hegel's view is more organic. Progress is cyclical, conflict-driven, and self-surpassing. Every advance contains its downfall because it carries unresolved contradictions. The Enlightenment's faith in reason, for instance, led to both scientific liberation and the mechanization of human life. Industrialization freed people from nature, but enslaved them to machines. These aren't accidents, they're dialectical reversals, spirit learning through its own excesses. That's why Hegel's optimism is different from naive idealism. He doesn't believe history inevitably gets better. He believes history inevitably gets smarter. Spirit learns by making mistakes, by living through the consequences of its own misunderstandings. That's the deepest kind of realism, a recognition that suffering and contradiction aren't just obstacles to truth, they're part of truth's unfolding. Think about how this applies to the individual. You can't know who you are without going through contradictions, between what you want and what the world demands, between who you think you are and how others see you. Growth comes when you stop treating these opposites as enemies and start seeing them as aspects of a larger self. You realize you were never just one fixed identity, you were a movement between identities, a process of becoming. That's Hegel's insight about the self in miniature, that the self isn't a thing, it's a development.
Even modern neuroscience echoes this. The brain is constantly predicting, correcting, adapting, a dialectical loop between expectation and experience. Learning happens through error. Consciousness refines itself by confronting the mismatch between what it assumes and what it perceives. That's the same pattern that Hegel saw in logic and history, knowledge evolving through its own negations. Hegel's idea of the end of history fits into this framework. He didn't mean history literally stops. He meant that once spirit fully understands its own process, once humanity realizes that freedom, reason, and contradiction are the same movement, there's no longer an external beyond to strive for. History becomes self-conscious. We start creating consciously instead of blindly reacting. In that sense, the end of history is the beginning of wisdom, when the world understands itself as a rational whole, not as a collection of disconnected events. That's the same pattern that Hegel saw in logic and history, knowledge evolving through its own negations. Even in the technological world we live in now, with AI, digital networks, and global interdependence, the dialectic is everywhere. Technology connects and alienates, empowers and enslaves. The internet gives everyone a voice, but drowns meaning in noise. Each innovation solves one problem and creates another, pushing us toward higher integration. Spirit hasn't stopped moving, it's just speaking a new language. Data, algorithms, digital consciousness. If Hegel were alive, he'd probably say that AI is spirit externalizing its own thinking, reason creating a mirror to understand itself. And that's what his philosophy keeps teaching, that every form of alienation is also a path to self-realization. Every fragmentation of spirit, whether through politics, technology, or culture, is a necessary step in the total process of understanding. Reality doesn't reject its contradictions, it lives through them. To think like Hegel is to accept that wholeness isn't peace, but perpetual movement, a unity that never freezes. When Hegel talks about spirit, he isn't describing something mystical or ghostly. He's describing the total process of consciousness becoming aware of itself. Not just in individual minds, but in culture, politics, art, and science. Spirit is the collective movement of human understanding as it externalizes itself into the world, confronts its own creations, and then reabsorbs them as self-knowledge. Every era of history, every civilization is a stage in spirit's attempt to recognize itself. That's why for Hegel, philosophy, religion, and art all express the same drive, the need for the infinite to know itself through the finite. To understand spirit is to understand that we are not separate from the world we analyze. Every institution, every moral code, every idea of progress or justice, these aren't just external systems, they're mirrors of our collective self-consciousness. When societies evolve, they aren't merely rearranging material structures, they're working through contradictions in spirit's awareness of freedom. Freedom is the engine of history because it's the form spirit takes when it knows itself. A person who acts freely isn't just doing what they want. They're expressing the self-determining movement of reality itself. That's why Hegel links freedom with reason. To be rational is to act in accordance with what you truly are, a conscious part of an unfolding totality. But freedom doesn't begin as awareness. It begins as instinct, then becomes conflict, then becomes understanding. The dialectic of spirit passes through stages, the natural, the social, the political, the moral, each one a partial realization of freedom that must collapse under its contradictions. In nature, spirit is asleep. In art, it starts dreaming. In religion, it senses its own infinity but still imagines it as something outside itself, God, the divine, the beyond. In philosophy, spirit wakes up and recognizes that the divine it's been chasing was its own rational nature all along. This is what Hegel means by absolute knowing, not omniscience, but reconciliation with the process. The absolute isn't a thing or a final answer, it's the understanding that every finite expression already contains the infinite within it.
Hegel would say that we are living in a dialectical storm,
a phase where the opposites are colliding harder than ever. Individual freedom versus collective structure, rational progress versus emotional chaos, global unity versus cultural division. Each side intensifies the other. But from a Hegelian view, this isn't the end of civilization. It's another turning point in spirit's education. The conflict isn't a mistake, it's how freedom deepens its meaning. The individual plays a crucial role in this story. For Hegel, individuality isn't about being separate from the whole. It's about being the point where the whole becomes self-aware. Each person is spirit-localized, consciousness condensed into a singular perspective. But individuality without universality becomes egoism, and universality without individuality becomes tyranny. The ethical life, what Hegel calls Sittlichkeit, is the reconciliation of both. It's when personal will and collective reason align, when freedom is not the absence of constraints, but the recognition that our constraints express our shared rational nature. Laws, customs, and institutions aren't prisons, they're embodiments of spirit's understanding of itself at a certain stage. Of course, that doesn't mean the system is perfect. Every institution eventually ossifies. Every form of order becomes self-contradictory. The dialectic moves on. When spirit encounters its own creations, the state, the church, the economy, and finds that they no longer express freedom, it negates them. That's revolution, not in the sense of violent overthrow necessarily, but in the sense of transformation. Spirit always transcends itself. It breaks its own forms to keep becoming what it is, absolute movement. This is what makes Hegel's view of history so different from a simple timeline of events. History isn't just what happened, it's the logic of spirit working through time. Wars, revolutions, renaissances, they're the visible side of an invisible process. Ideas change the world not because they're preached, but because they reveal contradictions that reality can no longer sustain. The French Revolution, for example, wasn't just politics. It was spirit realizing that human freedom couldn't remain an abstract ideal. It had to take institutional form. When those forms failed to embody the ideal, new contradictions arose, leading to new stages. This rhythm doesn't stop. Every system produces its opposite, and every opposite forces a synthesis. It's why modern life feels like it's constantly tearing itself apart, because it is. That's how consciousness grows. From a Hegelian lens, even the chaos of social media, the polarization of politics, the collapse of old ideologies, all of it is spirit shedding its old skin. The world isn't dying, it's molting. If you see reality this way, it changes how you live. You stop asking for final answers or permanent stability. You start seeing everything, your career, your beliefs, your relationships, as dialectical movements. You fail, learn, adapt, repeat. Each contradiction pushes you closer to understanding yourself as part of something bigger. Freedom stops being about control and becomes about participation. To live Hegelianly is to move with the process instead of resisting it, to realize that what looks like breakdown is often breakthrough. That's also why Hegel thought philosophy had to be systematic, not because life fits neatly into a structure, but because thought itself must reflect the total movement. To understand freedom, you have to see how logic, nature, and spirit form a continuous process. The logic describes pure thought, the categories through which being differentiates itself. Nature is thought externalized, spirit alienated into space and time. Spirit is nature returning to itself through self-consciousness. It's one circle with three phases, each necessary to the whole. If you pull back far enough, this vision is staggering. The universe isn't a collection of objects, it's an organism of self-knowing. Reality isn't a product of thought, it is thought, unfolding dialectically through contradictions. And what we call understanding is just reality recognizing itself through us.
That's the essence of Hegel's absolute idealism. Hegel's logic isn't just a way of doing philosophy, it's a way of understanding reality as a living process. Most people think of logic as something cold and rigid, a set of rules about how to reason correctly. But Hegel's logic is alive. It's the heartbeat of existence itself. He believed that the universe doesn't just exist, it thinks. Every part of reality, from atoms to human thought, follows a rational movement, an inner logic of development. The logic, for Hegel, is not about syllogisms or propositions. It's the science of how being unfolds into meaning. He begins with the simplest possible thought, pure being. But pure being, when you think about it, has no content, no distinction, no quality. It's indistinguishable from nothing. So being immediately collapses into nothing. Yet the moment you recognize that, you realize that the movement between being and nothing, their interplay, their oscillation, is what actually exists. That movement is becoming. This is Hegel's opening move, the recognition that truth isn't static, but dynamic. Existence is process. It's the transition between opposites that makes anything real.
This small insight sets the pattern for everything that follows. Every concept, every phenomenon, contains a contradiction within itself. That contradiction drives it to evolve into something higher that resolves and includes both sides. When you follow that logic consistently, you get a universe that's self-developing, self-correcting, and self-conscious. What looks like chaos or randomness is, from this perspective, spirit figuring itself out through difference. The cosmos isn't a machine, it's a conversation between opposites. In modern terms, you can see Hegel's logic everywhere. In biology, evolution works through dialectical tension, adaptation and resistance, stability and mutation. In psychology, personal growth happens when a person's self-concept collides with experience and forces a new synthesis, a more integrated identity. In technology, innovation arises from the clash between limitations and creativity. Every new invention solves one problem and creates another, and the tension drives further innovation. That's pure dialectic at work. Each solution carries its negation, and progress comes through that friction. This is why Hegel's system is so misunderstood. It's not about finding eternal truths. It's about understanding truth as the movement between opposites. The mistake is to think of contradictions as errors. For Hegel, they're the fuel. Every idea that becomes too rigid, too absolute, eventually breaks apart under its own weight, and from that collapse, something more complete emerges. This is how thought and reality matures. If you apply that to your own life, it's transformative. Every time you hit a wall, every time your beliefs or goals fall apart, that's not failure in Hegelian terms, it's negation, a necessary step in the evolution of your understanding. You start with a thesis, an identity, a worldview, a plan. Then reality hits back, the antithesis. That tension forces a synthesis, a higher version of yourself that understands both sides. The process never ends, but each turn of the spiral brings you closer to wholeness. You can see this same pattern at every level of society. Cultures evolve dialectically. One generation builds structures of meaning, the next rebels against them, exposing their contradictions. The result is a synthesis that combines the truth of both sides. The Renaissance negated the medieval world, but carried forward its spiritual depth. The Enlightenment negated dogma, but kept the pursuit of truth. Modernity negated tradition, but now struggles with nihilism, which might push humanity toward a new synthesis where freedom and meaning are reconciled. Hegel's logic gives you a way to read history as a living text written by spirit itself. Even the structure of the internet follows this pattern. At first, it was pure freedom. Everyone could share, connect, express. Then came the backlash, surveillance, polarization, misinformation. But these aren't random glitches. They're contradictions revealing what the system lacks: self-awareness, ethical grounding, coherence. The next synthesis might be a digital consciousness that integrates freedom with responsibility. If you look through Hegel's eyes, technology isn't just a tool, it's spirit extending its mind into material form. Hegel's logic also dissolves the divide between subject and object. He rejects the idea that we're separate observers looking at an external world. For him, the active knowing is part of what's known. Reality and thought are two sides of the same process. When you think about something, you're not standing outside it, you're participating in the universe's self-reflection. That's what absolute idealism really means, that reality is a thought process, and thought is reality knowing itself. It doesn't mean the world is all in your head, it means your head is part of the world's way of thinking about itself. Once you grasp that, the boundary between philosophy and science, or between logic and life, starts to blur. The same dialectical rhythm pulses through everything, from the formation of galaxies to human ethics. That's why Hegel saw the logic, nature, and spirit as one continuous system. Logic is pure thought, the inner skeleton of reality. Nature is that thought externalized, spirit made visible. And spirit is nature returning home, self-conscious thought recognizing itself in the world. It's an infinite circle that never closes, because every completion is the beginning of a new cycle. When you look at life that way, meaning stops being something you need to find. Meaning is the movement itself. Every struggle, every paradox, every loss is spirit working through its own misunderstanding. There's no static enlightenment waiting at the end. The enlightenment is the process of becoming conscious. To live Hegelianly is to see yourself as a moment of the world's own thought, a spark of self-awareness in an endless dialectic. Hegel's understanding of reason and freedom ties directly into ethics and politics. He doesn't see morality as a set of arbitrary rules or personal preferences. Morality is the unfolding of rational freedom in real life. For him, freedom isn't about doing whatever you feel like, it's about acting in accordance with the rational structures that organize human life, the ones that allow you and others to realize your potential. In other words, freedom is relational. You're free when your actions respect the freedom of others, and society is free when its institutions reflect rational principles.
This is where Hegel introduces the concept of Sittlichkeit, ethical life. Unlike abstract morality, Moralität, which exists in thought alone, ethical life exists in institutions. The family, civil society, and the state are the main stages. In the family, individuals first learn love, unity, and responsibility. But the family is private and particular. It cannot fully express universal freedom. Civil society allows individuals to pursue their own interests, interact economically, and negotiate differences under the rule of law. It's a space of tension. Freedom exists, but so do inequalities and conflicts. That's necessary. Friction drives development. The state, in Hegel's view, is the culmination. It's where private interests and universal reason meet. The state embodies the rational order of society. It's where freedom becomes objective. Laws and institutions aren't constraints to be resented. They're expressions of spirit organizing itself rationally. True freedom doesn't happen outside society. It happens within it when individuals recognize themselves in its structure. That's why Hegel famously called the state the march of God in the world, not in a religious sense, but because the state is spirit making its rational self-consciousness visible in history. But Hegel's vision is dynamic. No state, no institution, no law is final. Each embodies freedom imperfectly, producing contradictions that must be overcome. Revolutions, reforms, and cultural shifts are all part of spirit learning to express freedom more fully. The dialectic drives politics forward, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, each stage building on and correcting the last. Even failures or injustices aren't wasted. They force adaptation and deeper awareness. This framework also explains Hegel's view of history. He sees human history not as a random collection of events, but as the record of spirit realizing freedom. Early societies restricted freedom to rulers. Classical Greece extended it to some citizens. Modernity pushes toward universal self-determination. Conflicts, wars, and social crises aren't accidents. They're moments where contradictions in freedom become visible and demand resolution. History, in other words, is the slow awakening of spirit to its own possibilities. Hegel's insights apply to modern social issues, too. Take inequality, for instance. Inequality isn't just a material problem, it's a structural problem of recognition. When some people are denied the chance to express their rational will, to participate fully in society, spirit encounters its own limitation. That tension drives reforms and revolutions, whether through civil rights movements, democratic expansion, or legal innovation. Freedom advances not automatically, but dialectically, through struggle and recognition. At the individual level, Hegel's framework reshapes how we think about ethics. We're not free by ignoring others, we're free by recognizing ourselves in a network of mutual responsibilities. Acting rationally means understanding how your choices affect the larger system of human life. Alienation, selfishness, or short-sightedness aren't just personal failings, they're moments where spirit fails to recognize itself. Ethics becomes less about guilt or rules and more about understanding your place in a living, rational whole. Even the tension between personal desire and societal duty makes sense through Hegel. Individuals develop by confronting limitations, external laws, other people's freedom, natural constraints, and integrating them into higher self-consciousness. This is how freedom matures, through limitation, not in opposition to it. Desire must be disciplined, creativity structured, and individuality expressed in ways that harmonize with the universal. The dialectic of personal and collective life is what makes ethical development possible. In modern political philosophy, Hegel's ideas still resonate. Democratic institutions, human rights, social contracts all reflect attempts to embody rational freedom. Even social and technological revolutions are dialectical. Innovations create freedom, but also new problems, forcing adaptation. The internet, global finance, AI, all of these expand human capability while exposing new contradictions in power, knowledge, and ethics. Understanding these through Hegel gives perspective. Each problem is not a failure, but part of the system learning itself. Hegel's ethics and politics connect back to art, religion, and philosophy. Art teaches us to perceive spirit sensuously. Religion teaches us to feel its infinity, and philosophy teaches us to think it clearly. Together, they form the educational journey of spirit, from sensation to feeling to reason, from partial to universal consciousness, from limitation to freedom. Ethics and politics are just the practical side of this journey, freedom expressed in daily life, institutions, and history. Hegel's philosophy also gives a radical perspective on identity and culture. For him, individual identity is never isolated. It develops through recognition by others. You can't fully know yourself in a vacuum. Self-consciousness is born in the encounter with other self-conscious beings. This is the famous master-slave dialectic. The master thinks he's free because he dominates, but his freedom depends on the recognition of the slave. The slave, through labor and engagement with reality, develops true self-consciousness. Freedom, in other words, isn't about domination, it's about mutual recognition. Every relationship, from friendship to governance, contains this dynamic.
Culture, art, and language are extensions of this principle. They are the arenas where spirit externalizes itself and negotiates identity collectively. Every society develops norms, stories, and symbols that encode shared understanding. These aren't arbitrary, they're the crystallization of historical consciousness. When you engage with culture, literature, music, traditions, and rituals, you participate in spirit's self-education. Culture shapes you. You reshape it. And through that feedback, identity becomes richer and more complex. History itself is a cultural process. Hegel sees historical movements not as random chaos, but as the unfolding of spirit through particular societies, epochs, and ideas. Revolutions, artistic renaissances, philosophical breakthroughs, all are moments where spirit confronts contradictions, negates old forms, and produces higher forms of freedom and consciousness. The struggle of ideas, clashes of power, and shifts in norms are not mistakes. They're the necessary stages of collective self-realization. Modern consciousness reflects Hegel's dialectic in microcosm. Every person navigates contradictions, desires versus responsibilities, personal goals versus social expectations, past conditioning versus future aspirations. Growth occurs when these contradictions are recognized and integrated. Alienation, confusion, or failure aren't dead ends. They're the raw material for the next synthesis, a higher stage of self-awareness. This is why Hegel's thought resonates with modern psychology and personal development. He shows that the difficulties of life are integral to learning who we are and becoming free. Technology and globalization extend Hegel's insights to a planetary scale. Social media, AI, and global networks are new forms of spirit externalizing itself. They magnify contradictions, freedom versus control, knowledge versus misinformation, individuality versus collective norms. But these contradictions are exactly what drives evolution, technologically, socially, and ethically. Every crisis, breakdown, or conflict forces adaptation, reflection, and a new synthesis. History and consciousness continue to evolve, just in faster and more complex forms. Even creativity and innovation can be seen through Hegel's lens. A new idea or invention emerges by confronting the limits of existing solutions. It solves a problem, but simultaneously creates new tensions. The innovation is both a thesis and a beginning of its antithesis, pushing the dialectic forward. This pattern is visible in science, engineering, art, and philosophy. Every breakthrough carries the seeds of its own transformation. Spirit never stops moving, it just expresses itself in ever more sophisticated ways. Hegel also reframes morality and social responsibility. Ethics is not about abstract rules, but about recognizing yourself in others. Freedom is relational. Your liberty exists within a network of obligations and recognitions. Laws, customs, and institutions aren't shackles. They're the structures through which rational freedom is realized. Individual growth and social progress are inseparable. One advances by participating in the other. This gives Hegel a relevance for modern debates about justice, rights, and governance, because it frames progress as a process, not a fixed outcome. Ultimately, Hegel's philosophy provides a map for understanding complexity. Life, culture, politics, and consciousness are interwoven dialectical systems. Contradictions are not failures, but the engine of development. The universe, history, society, and the self are all expressions of spirit, unfolding, learning, and realizing freedom. The more you see life this way, the more you recognize that every challenge, conflict, and paradox is an opportunity, a step in the ongoing evolution of thought, identity, and reality itself. Hegel's philosophy is incredibly relevant when we look at modern challenges like technology, AI, and societal change. Think about AI for a second. Machines learning from data, correcting mistakes, adapting, and improving over time. From a Hegelian perspective, that's a small-scale dialectical process,
a reflection of spirit externalizing thought into material systems. Human knowledge becomes encoded in algorithms, and those algorithms interact with the world, producing new data, new contradictions, and new opportunities for learning. Just like consciousness evolves by encountering limits, AI evolves through trial, error, and feedback loops. Technology amplifies contradictions in human life too. The internet, for example, gives unprecedented freedom of expression, but also creates misinformation, echo chambers, and digital alienation. Social media allows connection, but intensifies comparison and competition. These contradictions are not mistakes of design, they're the necessary friction through which society learns about freedom, responsibility, and communication. In Hegelian terms, the world externalizes spirit through technology, exposing limits that must be overcome for the next synthesis of understanding. Societal change works in the same way. Movements for equality, climate action, or political reform arise from contradictions between ideals and reality. People recognize the gap between what society is and what it could be. That tension drives activism, debate, and institutional reform, the practical side of spirit's self-realization. Progress isn't linear or guaranteed, but every clash of interests, every crisis of values is a step in the dialectical process. What appears chaotic is actually spirit moving through contradiction toward higher self-awareness.
Hegel's philosophy also reframes creativity. Artistic innovation isn't just personal inspiration. It's a reflection of historical spirit. Each movement, classical, romantic, modernist, postmodern, arises from the limits of the previous forms. Artists confront contradictions in perception, society, or human nature, and produce work that both preserves and transforms what came before. Creativity, then, is a dialectical process. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. New meaning emerging from the tension of old ideas. On an individual level, Hegel teaches that personal development mirrors the dialectic. Growth happens through encountering limits, contradictions, and failures. You develop not by avoiding conflict, but by engaging it with consciousness, integrating lessons, and moving to a higher level of self-consciousness. Alienation, mistakes, and setbacks are the raw material of freedom, opportunities for synthesis and transformation. The path to self-realization is ongoing. It never ends, because spirit never stops evolving. Hegel also gives a framework for understanding meaning in a complex world. Life, identity, and culture aren't isolated puzzles to solve. They're interwoven systems of relationships, history, and consciousness. Meaning emerges from the interplay of contradictions, not from static answers. Technology, globalization, and cultural shifts all create friction. But through that friction, humanity collectively learns about freedom, responsibility, and rationality. Every challenge is a moment in spirit's self-education. Even moral and political responsibility becomes clearer through Hegel. Individual freedom is inseparable from recognition of others. To act ethically is to act in ways that harmonize personal will with the rational structures of society. Laws, norms, and institutions aren't obstacles. They're the concrete expression of collective rational freedom. Progress happens when individuals and communities internalize and expand these structures, resolving contradictions at higher levels. In short, Hegel offers a map for navigating modern life. Whether we're dealing with AI, global crises, social inequality, or personal growth, the dialectical method helps us understand how contradictions are productive, how conflict drives development, and how freedom unfolds through awareness, action, and integration. Spirit, the rational, self-conscious force underlying reality, is constantly learning,
and we are both participants and reflections of that learning. Hegel's view of modern identity builds directly on his idea that self-consciousness emerges through recognition and contradiction. You are never simply you in isolation. Your identity is shaped by interactions, culture, and history. Every choice, relationship, and engagement with the world is part of how spirit knows itself. Conflicts you experience with others, society, or even within yourself aren't just obstacles. They are the mechanisms through which your consciousness expands. The more contradictions you face and integrate, the richer and freer your self-understanding becomes. Creativity, in Hegel's framework, is also a process of dialectical engagement. True innovation arises when old forms, ideas, or practices no longer suffice, creating tension that demands resolution. Artists, scientists, and thinkers all participate in spirit's self-development by externalizing thought, confronting limitations, and producing new syntheses. Even failures and mistakes carry value. They reveal what cannot hold and guide the next stage of creation. Modern art, technological innovation, and scientific progress all follow this rhythm.
In politics and ethics, Hegel's insight emphasizes the relational nature of freedom. Individual rights, social responsibility, and institutional structures are not separate realms, they are interdependent. A person is free when their actions recognize and respect the freedom of others. And a society is rational when its laws and institutions reflect the collective rational will. Conflicts, debates, and reforms are not failures of society. They are dialectical processes pushing toward higher integration of freedom and rationality. Ultimately, Hegel's philosophy offers a framework for understanding life as a dynamic, interdependent system. Human identity, creativity, society, and technology are all expressions of spirit, a self-developing, self-conscious process. Contradiction, tension, and struggle are not signs of disorder. They are the mechanism through which understanding, freedom, and meaning emerge. By thinking dialectically, we see that every challenge, every failure, and every breakthrough is part of the same ongoing process of self-realization, both individually and collectively. Hegel's philosophy also provides a lens for understanding modern culture and learning. Culture is not just decoration or entertainment. It's the externalized thought of spirit, the collective consciousness of a society made visible in art, literature, music, rituals, and norms. Every cultural product embodies contradictions between tradition and innovation, form and content, individual expression and social expectation. By engaging with culture thoughtfully, we participate in spirit's ongoing self-education, learning about freedom, meaning, and the patterns of human consciousness. Education, too, is dialectical. True learning is not memorization or passive absorption. It's the active confrontation of ideas, the integration of contradictions, and the transformation of understanding. When you challenge assumptions, grapple with opposing viewpoints, and reflect critically on experience, you're participating in the same movement of thought that governs reality itself. Knowledge grows through tension, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, each stage building on and correcting the last. That's why Hegel sees philosophy as the highest form of learning. It traces the development of thought through history, society, and consciousness, showing how contradictions lead to higher understanding. Human potential is understood in the same way. Hegel doesn't see development as linear or guaranteed. It unfolds through struggle. Individual talents, collective achievements, and social structures all evolve dialectically. Growth happens when limitations are confronted and integrated into higher forms. Personal challenges, societal conflicts, and even global crises are not meaningless disruptions. They are catalysts for transformation. Spirit,
The rational, self-conscious force of reality moves through these contradictions, and by participating consciously, we accelerate both personal and collective evolution. In modern life, this perspective can be applied practically. When facing failure or confusion, you can see it as a dialectical moment, a necessary tension that propels growth. In relationships, conflicts are opportunities for mutual recognition and deeper understanding. In work and creativity, obstacles reveal the limits of current systems and stimulate innovation. Even social and technological upheaval, from digital disruption to climate change, becomes a field where spirit confronts its contradictions and evolves. Nothing is wasted. Every challenge is part of the process of self-realization. Hegel's philosophy also emphasizes the interconnectedness of all human activity. Politics, ethics, art, science, and personal life are not separate domains, but interdependent expressions of spirit. And moral action resonates socially. Cultural innovation influences consciousness. Scientific discovery reshapes understanding. The dialectical process links them all. Each contradiction, each synthesis propagates across the system, producing new forms of knowledge, freedom, and integration. Recognizing this interconnectedness allows individuals and societies to act with awareness, understanding the ripple effects of their choices. Ultimately, Hegel offers a vision of life as dynamic, purposeful, and intelligent. Reality is not chaotic or meaningless. It is a self-organizing process striving towards self-consciousness and freedom. Contradictions are the engine of growth. Struggle is the method of development, and participation is the path to understanding. By seeing life dialectically, we grasp that every personal, social, and global challenge is part of the same movement, spirit, learning, evolving, and actualizing its potential. Hegel's philosophy can directly guide how we approach modern decision-making, creativity, ethics, and personal growth. Life constantly presents us with complex problems, contradictions, and uncertainties. The Hegelian approach is to see these not as obstacles, but as opportunities for synthesis. Every decision you make, every challenge you face, contains opposing forces: desire and responsibility, risk and safety, individuality and social expectation. By recognizing and integrating these tensions, you move toward higher understanding and more effective action.
In creativity, this principle is essential. Innovation rarely comes from simply building on what already exists. It emerges from friction, the clash between existing knowledge and new possibilities, the tension between convention and imagination. Artists, scientists, and entrepreneurs all operate dialectically, confronting limits, integrating contradictions, and producing something that transcends prior forms. Even failures are productive. They reveal what doesn't work and illuminate the path towards synthesis. Ethics, under Hegel, is relational and dynamic. Freedom isn't about acting in isolation, but acting in ways that respect the freedom of others. Individual choices are meaningful only within a broader network of relationships, social norms, and institutional frameworks. Ethical growth comes from negotiating contradictions between personal desires and collective responsibilities, integrating them into a higher form of understanding. Alienation, guilt, or conflict are not failures. They are stages of development, necessary for learning how to act rationally and freely. Hegel also provides insight into personal growth. True self-development occurs through engagement with challenges, conflicts, and contradictions. When your goals collide with reality, when relationships create friction, or when societal norms push back, you are forced to confront limitations. Integrating these tensions leads to higher self-consciousness, deeper understanding, and greater freedom. The process is ongoing. Growth never ends because spirit never stops evolving. Life is a continuous movement of becoming, and our role is to participate consciously. Modern complexity, globalization, technology, Environmental crises, social change, can be understood through Hegel's lens as large-scale dialectical systems. Every crisis exposes contradictions, every disruption highlights limitations, and every conflict presents an opportunity for synthesis. By understanding the world dialectically, we can approach problems strategically, recognizing patterns of tension, transformation, and integration. This perspective helps individuals, organizations, and societies navigate uncertainty with clarity and purpose. Hegel's approach also emphasizes interconnectedness. Personal decisions affect society. Cultural innovation influences consciousness, and technological change reshapes ethical frameworks. Nothing exists in isolation. Understanding the ripple effects of actions allows for more thoughtful, rational, and effective engagement with the world. This holistic view transforms chaos into a learning process, failure into feedback, and contradiction into progress. Ultimately, living Hegelianly is about conscious participation in the dialectical process. It's about seeing contradictions as opportunities, conflicts as lessons, and challenges as catalysts for growth. Freedom is realized not by avoiding limitations, but by engaging them creatively and rationally. Meaning is not found outside life, but emerges from participation in the ongoing evolution of spirit. Every choice, every action, and every struggle contributes to the unfolding of consciousness, both personally and collectively. Hegel's philosophy remains highly relevant to modern society and culture, especially when we think about how people interact with technology, social systems, and information. Society today is a network of interdependent processes, much like Hegel's conception of spirit. Every institution, norm, and technology is part of a feedback loop. Actions create consequences, consequences generate tension, tension drives change, and change produces new structures. Social media, global communication, and digital economies are amplifiers of these processes, making contradictions more visible and accelerating dialectical evolution. Technology, from AI to advanced automation, embodies Hegel's principle of externalized thought. Machines learn, adapt, and correct themselves, functioning as a mirror of human rationality extended into material systems. AI reflects human knowledge, but also exposes limitations, biases, and gaps in understanding. The friction created, ethical dilemmas, economic shifts, social tension, is exactly the kind of contradiction Hegel described as necessary for the growth of spirit. Each disruption is not just a challenge, it's a teaching moment for collective consciousness. Cultural evolution works the same way. Ideas, trends, and artistic movements are born from contradictions between tradition and innovation, individual expression and social norms, possibility and limitation. The clash between opposing perspectives creates synthesis, producing higher levels of awareness and creativity. Art, literature, music, and philosophy all function as mechanisms through which spirit explores itself and communicates insights across generations. Every cultural breakthrough both preserves and transforms what came before, illustrating the dialectical process in practice. Ethics and social responsibility also reflect this dynamic. Freedom isn't simply doing what one wants, it's the rational alignment of personal action with the conditions of collective life. Rights, obligations, laws, and norms are not constraints imposed arbitrarily, but the concrete structures that allow freedom to flourish. Conflicts, debates, and reforms are dialectical movements, contradictions revealing inadequacies, demanding adaptation, and producing more integrated forms of social rationality. Participating consciously in these processes allows individuals to grow ethically while contributing to societal progress.
Personal development mirrors these larger patterns. Growth emerges through the integration of contradictions. Challenges, failures, and setbacks are not signs of inadequacy. They are the raw material for building higher self-consciousness.
Each conflict between desire and responsibility, expectation and reality, or individuality and collectivity is an opportunity to synthesize a more coherent and liberated self. Modern life, with its complexity and interconnectedness, accelerates these dialectical experiences, offering countless opportunities for learning and transformation. Hegel's philosophy encourages a proactive, engaged approach to life. By viewing contradictions as fuel rather than obstacles, disruptions as lessons rather than disasters, and limitations as catalysts rather than barriers, we can navigate modern challenges with clarity. Freedom and meaning are not static achievements, but dynamic processes that unfold through participation in the world. Every interaction, innovation, and challenge contributes to spirit's ongoing self-realization, making each of us a participant in history's dialectical journey. Applying Hegel to personal growth means seeing yourself as an active participant in a dialectical process rather than a passive observer of life. Every challenge you face, internal conflict, societal pressure, or unexpected failure, is a tension between opposing forces: your desires versus reality, your ideals versus limitations, your individuality versus social obligations. Growth happens when you recognize these tensions, confront them, and integrate their lessons into a higher level of self-consciousness. This is the core of Hegelian development: learning through contradiction. Ethical decision-making works the same way. Freedom isn't simply doing whatever you want. It's the alignment of your actions with rational principles that respect both your own development and the freedom of others. Every moral choice presents a dialectical tension: self-interest versus collective well-being, immediate gratification versus long-term responsibility. By consciously integrating these opposing forces, you act freely and rationally. Alienation, regret, or guilt are not failures. They're signals that the synthesis has not yet been completed, that there's work to be done to harmonize self and society. Creativity is another domain where Hegel shines. Innovation arises when old methods, ideas, or systems reach their limits and contradictions appear. Artists, scientists, and thinkers confront these limits, integrating tensions to produce something higher. Failures, experiments, and even mistakes are essential. They expose what cannot hold and force the evolution of thought and practice. In a Hegelian sense, every act of creation is a microcosm of spirit externalizing, confronting limitations, and achieving self-conscious synthesis. Daily life, too, becomes a training ground for dialectical engagement. Conflicts in relationships, workplace challenges, or ethical dilemmas are not random stressors. They are opportunities to refine judgment, awareness, and selfhood. By consciously observing contradictions and working to integrate them, you participate in spirit's self-realization. Modern complexity, from global networks to AI-driven systems, accelerates these experiences, forcing constant adaptation and learning. The more aware you are of the dialectical movement, the more effectively you navigate change and grow. Even our understanding of knowledge and learning is transformed. True comprehension comes from grappling with opposing perspectives, testing assumptions, and integrating insights into a coherent framework. Education is not rote memorization. It's a dialectical process of encountering, challenging, and synthesizing ideas. Each stage of understanding contains contradictions that must be resolved to reach a higher level of insight. This is why Hegel emphasizes the systematic nature of thought. Knowledge is a living, evolving process, not a static collection of facts. By living Hegelianly, you see that freedom, meaning, creativity, and ethical responsibility are inseparable. Contradictions are not obstacles to avoid,
but the mechanisms through which personal and collective consciousness evolves. Life's complexity becomes a field for engagement rather than frustration. The tension you encounter is the engine driving growth, understanding, and the realization of human potential.